Okay, let's respond to some things. What we have heard about the Common Core standards from the beginning of this effort is certain talking points that we hear over and over again. That this was a state-led effort. There was no federal involvement in it. These are rigorous standards. They are internationally benchmarked, and they will make our children college and career ready. None of that is true. Not a single point of that is true. Start with the state-led. They weren't state-led. They were created by two trade associations in Washington, D.C., neither of which had a grant of legislative authority from anybody to do anything. Most governors in the country, it was the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. Most of them, they don't even tell us who their members are. It's not all governors are active in the Governors Association. We know Nikki Haley in South Carolina's not in it. We know Rick Perry's not in it. So, and we don't know how many actual governors actually knew this was even going on. So, what we ended up with here was we ended up with a set of standards that were written by some people chosen by these private trade associations, and primarily chosen by the Gates Foundation, because the Gates Foundation is the one who is paying for it. It is absolutely true. These standards were not written by the federal government. They weren't. Neither was Obamacare. Obamacare wasn't written by the federal government. That statute was written and ready to go when the Obama administration came in. That's not a reason to stop looking at it, because it wasn't written by the federal government. These standards were written by essentially 5 people. There were 2 people who wrote the English language arts standards, David Coleman and Susan Pimentel. There were 3 people who wrote the math standards, Jason Zimba, Phil Darrow, and Bill McCallum. I think maybe 2 of those people had had experience writing standards before. David Coleman essentially is considered the architect of this. David Coleman has never taught English, and he's never written standards before. But he was chosen to write the English language arts standards for the entire country. Now, I don't know how that happened, and even the people who were involved, people who were on the validation committee, don't know how that happened. Why would they choose him? Who chose it? Nobody knows, but he wrote the standards. These standards are not rigorous. They've never been tested. They've never been piloted. I don't think that there are a lot of people in this country who are business people who would embark on some brand new experiment without testing it. You know, if McDonald's is bringing out a product, they pilot it in a few locations to see how it works. This was never done. These people who had never written standards before produced these standards. Oh, and by the way, on the English language arts standards, and I happen to know this because I'm friends with Dr. Sandra Stotsky, who is the leading English language arts expert in the country for standards, for K-12 standards. She wrote the standards in Massachusetts, which were by far the best in the country. She was on the Common Core Validation Committee, and she said, now, if you were choosing a group of people to write standards that would dictate what students are supposed to know for success in college English classes, who would you pick? You'd pick college professors, right? College English professors. And you'd pick high school English professors. You know how many were on the work team for the development of the English language arts standards? 0. Not a single college English professor, not a single high school English teacher. There were some on the feedback committee, but the feedback committee, as people have told us who were on the feedback committee, we sent in feedback and it just disappeared into a black hole. We don't know what happened. So, anyway, so are these standards internationally benchmarked? No, they were supposed to be. When we agreed to adopt these standards in exchange for some race to the top money, we thought they were going to be internationally benchmarked, and they weren't. It turns out they weren't. Dr. Stotsky, who was on the validation committee, has asked, during her service on the validation committee, she asked over and over again for the records for the benchmarking. She said, show us what countries you're using for the benchmarking. And they ignored her. They never showed it. Now they don't even say anymore that they're internationally benchmarked. Now they say they are informed by the standards of the high-achieving countries, but we don't know what that means. We ended up with standards that are really an industrial model. This is not an education model, it's a workforce development model. What the standards are geared to do is to produce people who are qualified for non-selective community colleges or for entry-level jobs. That's the point. The point is to develop the workforce. This was admitted by Jason Zimba, one of the people who wrote the math standards. He was at a meeting in Massachusetts in 2010, and he said, when we're talking about college ready, we're talking about non-selective colleges. We're not talking about UGA or Georgia Tech. We're talking about the local community college where you pay your money. And I have nothing against local community colleges. They do great work and they fill a niche, but don't tell me that you're preparing my child for a selective university when you're not. And he admitted that that's what the standards are designed to do. We've heard that Georgia had a seat at the table. We've heard this over and over again, that Georgia had a seat at the table. If these were Georgia standards, we wouldn't have a seat at the table. We would have the table. Why should we be having to negotiate with people from other states, negotiate with people from the National Governors Association, negotiate with people from the Gates Foundation to do our own standards? This is not what I think Georgians want. We've been told that the Fordham Institute, which ranks state standards and evaluates them all over the place, said that Georgia standards are pretty good and they like Common Core a lot too. What we haven't heard is that the Fordham Institute is Common Core's paid lobbyist. They have accepted $6 million from the Gates Foundation for the purpose of promoting Common Core. They accepted $1 million to do the study that analyzed Common Core and compared it to all the state standards. And not surprisingly, they came up with this report that, well, Common Core is better than most of the states. But even the Fordham Institute, because they have some glimmer of objectivity left, could not say that Georgia standards were worse. Georgia standards weren't worse, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We're told that we will change these standards if we want to, and we can step away at any time. The longer we wait to step away, the harder it gets, because the more millions of dollars you've poured into it, and you've got all the stuff bought, and you've got all of the professional development done, and everybody says, well, we've already spent too much on it, we can't pull away. But we certainly cannot change the standards unless we pull away. We can't just modify something here or modify something there, because that messes everything up. The whole point of Common Core is for every state to be doing exactly the same thing. And the testing goes with that. Now, you may have read that we've pulled out of the PARC testing, which is good. That's a good first step, because PARC was going to be a disaster, and we couldn't afford it. And so an expensive disaster is the worst kind of disaster. So we're out of PARC. We don't know yet what we're going to do. They're talking about going in with some other states and coming up with our own tests. Well, if that happens, we can't change our standards. We have to have the same standards as the other the states that we're in the test with. The whole point of this is to have everybody aligned, and the agreement that we signed to get into the Common Core State Standards Initiative said that we, and in our Race to the Top application, said that we are adopting standards that are put out by a consortium. The standards must be substantially identical across states. So that's what, and Common Core was the only set of standards that fit that. So the federal government just dangled the federal money. And this is the way they get what they want. It's not only in education, they do this everywhere. If they want you to alter your behavior to their liking, they will give you money. But only if you do this, not if you do that. So Georgia agreed to do this so we could get the money. And we got $400 million. Over 4 years, that's $100 million a year. Our education budget is about $13 billion a year. So $100 million a year is not a whole lot of money to be selling your birthright. Okay, we're told that these are just standards and they're not curriculum. They only say what children should know and be able to do, and we are in control of our curriculum. Well, there was a report that was put out by the Pioneer Institute back about 1.5 years ago. Pioneer Institute is an education reform outfit that has done a lot of good research. I urge you to go to their website and read some of the reports that they've done. They had a report that was written by 2 former U.S. Department of Education officials. The conclusion of the report was that this is going to inevitably result in a national curriculum, because that's the point of standards. That's why you have standards that drives curriculum. And certainly the testing will drive the curriculum as well. We are told that the teachers can still teach however they want to. Well, not necessarily. A teacher who wants to teach the standard algorithm to her first graders can't do it anymore. When I say the standard algorithm, I'm talking about the normal, thousands of years old way of adding numbers together or subtracting numbers. A teacher can't do that anymore. Common Core requires that you teach the fuzzy math. We're going back. There is nothing new under the sun. This is all recycled. It's all the recycled new math stuff that's in the lower grades. Now, they eventually teach the standard algorithm, but a first grade teacher can't teach it because, and I'll give you a story. In Indiana, which has a very, very active anti-Common Core movement, and in fact, they got legislation passed, we're happy to say. The whole movement started when a mother was looking at a paper that her daughter brought home in her third grade, from her third grade math. And the question was, Bridge A is 430 feet long, Bridge B is 410 feet long. Which bridge is longer? How do you know? Now, the how do you know is very important because under Common Core, you do not work problems. You explain problems. And which, by the way, well, we won't get into that. So the little girl wrote, Bridge A is longer. I know because 430 is greater than 410. That answer was wrong. The reason it was wrong was that she didn't do it right. She didn't explain it according to the sort of weird way of doing it. You don't start with the ones column, you start with the hundreds column, and then you move to the tens column, and it's just this bizarre way of doing it. And so this mother said, well, this is weird, and so she went and spoke to the teacher, and the teacher said, well, this is our new Common Core math book. And so the mother went and talked to the principal, who said, eventually, after many meetings, and they brought in the textbook publishers and all this stuff, and eventually the principal threw up his hands and he said, I know you don't like this. We don't like this either, but we have to teach it this way because this is the way it will be on the test, because this is the way Common Core requires it. So the idea that it doesn't tell teachers how to teach, Tanya and I were at the state GOP convention in May, and a middle school math teacher came up to us and had sort of a rant about Common Core. And he said that he was told that he needed to be teaching according to the project method. And he said, the project method doesn't work for math, and that's not the way I teach. And the principal said, well, you have to do it because that's what Common Core requires. So these standards are driving curriculum, and they are driving methods of teaching. And by the way, a teacher who wants to teach predominantly, say, 80 to 90% classic literature in her class can't do it under Common Core. Common Core requires that at least 50% of the English instruction in the English class, not across the curriculum, at least 50% be nonfiction informational text, which means you get rid of the great literature because you don't have time to teach it. There's nothing in Common Core that says you can't teach it, but you don't have time because the teacher's got to focus on teaching nonfiction informational text, things such as technical manuals, science documents, that sort of thing. That's what is on the list that are things to be taught under Common Core. I told my mother, who taught English for 30 years and taught me in 10th grade, what she would be teaching under Common Core, and she thought I was kidding. Unfortunately, I'm not. Okay, so we have heard that, well, let me tell you another little story. In South Carolina last year, we had a bill over there, and we had a lot of people, education administrators, who came and testified against the bill, and one lady stood up and said, I've heard a lot today about how this is unconstitutional and it's illegal, because, by the way, there are 3 federal statutes that prohibit the federal government from supervising, directing, or controlling curriculum. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're doing it through the testing, they're doing it through the race to the top, and imposing these standards. But anyway, the lady said that she had heard all this about how it was illegal and unconstitutional, but she said, I don't care about that. I just know that the standards are good. And I thought, well, there in a nutshell is what is wrong with our country. When somebody says, I don't care if it's legal, I don't care if it's constitutional, it's just a question of, is it good? So, are they good? Well, there are varying opinions about this, and there are teachers who like them, and there are a lot of teachers who don't. We know that the teachers who don't talk to us. They don't speak out. They say, don't use my name, I need my job. But we hear from teachers all over the state. There were 2 reports that were done recently about the Georgia standards specifically. Senator William Ligon is the senator who has the bill, SB 167, in the Senate, which would withdraw Georgia from these standards and put us back under our local control. He released 2 reports that were done. He released it on Monday, wasn't it? I think. Okay. One of them was done by Dr. Mary Kay Bacayao, who is a professor of math and science education at Mercer. And she compared the Georgia standards, the previous GPS, Georgia Performance Standards, to the Common Core and was astounded at what she found. She found out that under Common Core, these are the things that were in the previous Georgia Performance Standards that are no longer there. Probability, gone in the elementary grades. Mean, median, mode, and range, gone in the elementary grades. The concept of pi, including area and circumference of circles, gone in the elementary grades. Division of a fraction by a fraction, gone in the elementary grades. The fundamental theorem of arithmetic, prime factorization, gone completely. Using fractions, decimals, and percents interchangeably, gone completely. Measurement, including density and velocity, no measurement instruction after 5th grade. Inadequate readiness for algebra. Algebra has been moved to 9th grade from 8th grade, which means the majority of students, not all, but the majority of students will not get to calculus in high school as expected by selected universities. And geometry is being taught in an experimental way, never used successfully anywhere in the world in K-12. That's what Common Core says about, that's what she says about the math. Dr. James Milgram was the only mathematician on the Common Core Validation Committee, and when I say mathematician, what I mean is that he's the only person who was on the committee who has an advanced degree in mathematics as opposed to education. He refused to sign off on the standards because he said it is almost a joke to think that a child educated under Common Core would be ready for advanced or any mathematics at a university. Okay, and then we had another of the reports that Senator Ligon put out was done by Dr. Stotsky, who, as I said, wrote the Massachusetts standards, which were the gold standard in English language arts. And so she compared, she had never worked on the most recent Georgia Performance Standards, although she had done comparisons previously for the Fordham Institute, back before they started taking Gates money. And so she compared GPS with Common Core. And what she said was, overall, and there's a whole way that you do this, and you do these numbers and good content in certain areas. The Georgia standards were substantially better in all 4 areas that she looked at. One was reading, pedagogy, and independent reading. Georgia was 3.6, Common Core was 3.3. Value of literary study, Georgia 3.6, Common Core 1. That's because they reduced the literature so much. Organization and disciplinary coverage of the standards, Georgia 3.6, Common Core 1.7. And quality of the standards, generally Georgia 2.4, Common Core 1.4. For the total average, Georgia 3.3, Common Core 1.85. And she said that that when you talk about how the previous standards were so similar to Common Core, the reason that you can say that is that everything or most things in the Common Core are also included in the previous standards, but they didn't look at it in the reverse. They didn't look to see what was in the Georgia standards that is no longer in Common Core, and that's what makes the big difference, and that's why we're having to go through this massive professional development, because the standards are so different. So Dr. Stotsky said, these were her conclusions, Georgia should readopt its previous standards with some revisions spelled out below, because they are far superior to Common Core's. They emphasize reading far more than does Common Core. They stress the kind of reading, literary study, that fosters critical thinking, and they serve as far better guides to the kind of reading that secondary students in Georgia should be assigned in the school curriculum in order to be prepared for a meaningful high school diploma, whether they choose to go to an institution of higher education, go into an occupational trade, or go into the military. And she says Georgia should base its state assessments in reading and literature on its previous standards, not on Common Core's inferior language arts standards. And the last thing that I'll say about this is that there's another professor, University of Pennsylvania School of Education, who, along with some other people, examined Common Core, especially the math. They were interested in the math, because we're told that these standards are internationally benchmarked and they're just as good, and they're informed by the math standards of the high-achieving countries. And the countries that are always mentioned as the high-achieving countries that we want to emulate are Finland, Japan, and Singapore. Okay, so this report, which was put out by the educational researcher, looked at the overlap in Common Core in Finland. With Finland, it's 21%. With Japan, it's 17%. These are the math standards. In Singapore, 13%. And the reason that those percentages are so low, so little congruence between Common Core and these high-achieving country standards, is that these high-achieving countries have great emphasis on working problems, and Common Core doesn't. It doesn't want you to work problems, it wants you to explain problems. And they call that critical thinking and higher order thinking skills. But it's just the old new math that has now been recycled. We heard that Massachusetts had great standards and we wanted our standards to be that good. Well, then why didn't we adopt the Massachusetts standards? Why didn't we go and look at their standards, which are online? We can go look at them still, the ones that they've now given them up to get the Race to the Top money. So they're dumbing down too. But their old standards are online. If we wanted to improve our standards so we could have them just as good as Massachusetts, we could have done that. We could have gotten Indiana's math standards, and they were great until they gave them up to get Race, or to try to get Race to the Top money. Anything that is good about these standards, even if they were great, it's something that we could have done on our own, and we can do on our own. And if we do that, we can be ahead of the game. I'm not sure why we want to be common with all of these other states, because how are we going to increase and catapult ourselves above other states in the competition if we're doing exactly the same thing that everybody else is doing? But I just wanted to mention one thing. I think I've got just a minute left. The cost of this is going to be enormous. We're trying to tone down some of the costs by looking at by getting rid of PARC, which will help. But the governor keeps warning us that the tests are going to be expensive if we want to do all this, critical thinking, cutting edge testing. So we'll see how that comes out. And the last thing is the relationship to the data collection. And we are told Common Core does not require data collection on students, and that is absolutely true. The standards themselves do not require collection of student data. However, the whole scheme does. Race to the Top requires it. Getting stimulus money, which is what we got from the state fiscal stabilization fund, requires data collection, requires building these massive student databases. We have got the Georgia Race to the Top application, which, by the way, was financed, maybe not completely, but in part, by the Gates Foundation. That application talks about how Georgia wants to be on the cutting edge of data collection, and it wants to share this data with all of these researchers. And they can do it now because FERPA, which is the federal student privacy law, has been gutted by regulation by the Obama administration. And so now the data protections that used to be there are no longer protected. So, and we also have there was an article in the Augusta Chronicle about a year ago talking about how Georgia is building a data system to track students from preschool through PhD, which is actually not true because it goes to the workforce now. That's the whole idea. Remember, this is an industrial development model. We want to be able to track people from the time they're born to the time they finish their career, so we can see how everything worked when this person went to this education program, that he did Head Start, he didn't do Head Start, he graduated or he didn't graduate, he had this program or not that program, he went to college, what courses did he take, how well did he do, did he join the military, did he get in trouble with the law? The government wants to track all of that because they need data. It is an industrial workforce development model. So we have agreed to do this essentially. We don't know how much we're tracking. We're hoping to get the DOE at some point to say they will put online what they're actually collecting on students. But the idea that this is something that all this data just stays in Georgia, and it's not going to happen. It is not going to happen. The federal government is investing hundreds of millions of dollars in data systems, and it's going to get that data. So I think that I would just emphasize that this is a very serious situation. We are building a structure here that is very dangerous. It is very dangerous when you build a structure and tell the federal government, and tell, even more concerning, tell anonymous private interests that they now have some sort of hold over you, that they can dictate something, or they can keep you from doing what you want to do. If it's just federal, at least you could call your senator. But we now have people who are just funded by the Gates Foundation, who are in Washington, who are doing this because they are the experts and they know better than we do. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think that they do know better than we do. I think that pursuant to the Constitution, we should be educating our own children. We should be doing it the way we want to do, and the federal government and the Gates Foundation and the NGA and the Council of Chief State School Officers ought to have nothing to say about it. Thank you.